Walter, thank you so much for your time. It's great to see you again. You are an aerospace engineer interested in robotics, SpaceX, space. So it's really a pleasure to have you again. Lisa, I wanted to ask you if I can start with first question on SpaceX.
Sure.
You witnessed the fourth flight of Starship. You were there, South Padre. I wanted to ask you, how would you evaluate its success? We know that the Super Heavy had controlled landing. They were both ending in an ocean, including the Starship. How do you think it was actually successful?
Okay, I think it's mostly an unqualified success. And the reason why it's successful is because they decided to do the catch in the next one.
Yeah.
So if it had not met all those milestones, then you probably would not have seen we're going to do a catch on IFT-5. Now, as far as witnessing the launch, well, that's kind of, we have to qualify that a little bit. I certainly heard the launch.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was a very hazy day, so
Yeah.
we couldn't really see very much. And even the Starship could not burn that fog off. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a pretty heavy fog. So it was very successful because they had a couple of milestones. We got to remember, first is the booster, and then there's the Starship itself. And the first thing was like, is the booster going to make the landing? If it sticks the landing, then they're going to try to catch it on the next one. If things did not go well, like in the previous launch, then they would have had to do it again and again. So there was speculation that if it was successful, they would try to catch it on the next one. A lot of other people thought that, well, maybe they try to do 2 or 3 successful soft landings in the ocean before they would attempt the risky maneuver of trying to do the catch. So it seems like it was successful enough that they're ready to do that. And then also we had the Starship that landed in the Indian Ocean, and we know that it was very perilous coming down. We weren't sure it was going to make it, and they said the odds were very, very low on that. And that was very, very successful because it did make it, even though, let's say, not quite in the shape that you would like it, but they get so much valuable data, they know what to do for the next one. Now, whether that part succeeded or not has absolutely no impact on the first one. So the next launch, we're expecting it to be very exciting because they're going to try to do the catch.
Real landing.
And so anyone who goes there is going to be a real treat because not only are you going to have a launch, you're going to have a landing as well, which is going to be impressive. And catching it with the chopsticks in the air is going to be something else. And if the weather is clear, unlike that day, then something you might actually be able to witness from South Padre Island or Port Isabel or anywhere around there. So it's going to be very exciting. Now, we have to ask the question of like, why are they so confident that they can go ahead and do this? And the first thing is that they had a precise landing out somewhere in the Gulf, I think about 20 miles out. They didn't really say where the distance is, but we can see from the video that they had buoys placed out there to be able to show it coming down, which meant it had to land pretty close to the buoys because they knew where it was going to be. And Elon said that it was like a very precise landing. And then when it came down, it also did the power move. One SpaceX engineer referred to it as kind of a flex, that it really knew what was going on. But there could be a little bit of concern because one of the engines rutted on the way down. We could see it in the live stream that some debris went flying by, but it still corrected and came down where it was supposed to be. And so that could be possible concern of like, well, if the engine went out, should they go ahead and do it? And I would argue that no, actually, that was a better test of the system because it proved it could make it through an engine failure and still land. And so that's more important than if all the engines ran correctly. Now, I have a suspicion on what actually caused that engine going out, and I'll do a demonstration to explain that. First of all, I will use this bottle of water here, which I have not drunk enough water. I think we might be able to see where the water level is here. So when the booster was coming down, it was not coming down level. It was coming down a little bit like this. And the levels are not that high. They're more like down here. And you have like the sections down here where you have a manifold that for each engine is being fed from different places. So that means down here you have adequate coverage, like it was being fed there. But the higher one, and if you look at it, you'll notice the rud was on the high side, which is where it would have been low. So it's possible it was starved of the fuel going through there. And when that happens, you ingest bubbles into your system, and that's not good. And that's probably why it went out, is that it came down at a bit, maybe either a bit steeper angle than they expected, or maybe the fuel reserve was not as high as they wanted. So obviously, if it was really high, you see, you could tip it quite a bit. But if it's low, you don't have that much margin for error.
And what do you think then, can you come, what would you say is the probability it can have the real landing, Do you have a guess?
Okay, so I think, Elon has said he thinks it's 50-50, and he said the same thing about the Starship surviving. So when he says 50-50, maybe it's a much higher chance of that. It seems that they were able to get that maneuver. So there's going to be a couple levels of success. One is, are they actually really able to grab it? Or do they kind of come in and get very, very close and the last second decide to abort and bring it out to the beach because they think something is going wrong? And that, again, will show a little bit of control and redundancy going on there. But I think there's a pretty good chance, and whatever it is, it's going to be spectacular. So it's definitely going to be something that I'm going to be following. I hope to be there depending upon when it is. So your next question is, when do you think it's going to happen? No.
My question was, actually, what do you think of the mainstream media coverage? Because they wrote it's successful.
Yes.
Even them,
Yeah, even then. So it was, so I think there was only one that talked about, the first one that didn't explode. And it was like, okay.
Yeah.
But most of them were upbeat on it because they had to realize it was impressive. And the other thing about it, it was an incredible drama. Because think about those last 20 minutes when we're looking at that flap. And that flap is like falling apart, and you're like, oh, it's going, at any moment that's going to be the end of it. That's going to be the end of it. And it came all the way down and successfully did it. So I think just because of the drama, everyone realized this was an impressive engineering feat. And the two impressive engineering feats, the landing in the soft landing, and then the landing half a world away, was really something else to be able to see something like that. And we know that the next try is going to get better and better. But they had full control coming on down. You could see that they were able to hold it at an altitude of about 68 kilometers for quite a while as they started to bleed off a lot of the speed before they came through. And we can see that the material they're using is really, really tough. That to be able to go through that and have the hinge mechanism survive is remarkable.
Thank you so much. And now to question you wanted, or I was actually going to ask as well, when do you think it's going to happen? Elon Musk hinted it could be in July.
Yeah, he said in about a month. Okay, so about a month I think usually means more than a month and not less than a month. It could be anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks, right? Most people might say about a month, could be 5-6 weeks. Last time he said I think about 6 to 8 weeks after the last launch, and it was about a month beyond that. So I would take what he said and possibly add about a month. So that means it could be in July, but more likely late July at the earliest. More likely sometime in mid-August, I think it would be at that point that they would be kind of ready. However, the good news is this launch did absolutely nothing to the pad. So they could launch tomorrow if they had the booster and everything there from the standpoint of the pad. So that the pad did not have the problem like an IFT-1 where there were chunks of concrete that's blown all over the place. So it's in really good shape from that standpoint. It's just a question, are the boosters ready? Is everything else ready? And they're making upgrades also on the second one. So the question is, do you want to rush it? So unless they've already made those changes, and SpaceX was anticipating that, what was going to happen, they may have already made those changes to the Starship. So let's assume, the booster's ready to go. We've got a booster, it's ready, we're ready to go ahead and grab it. But we need to put the Starship on top. And if it's not quite ready yet because of those changes, that's going to delay the schedule a little bit. So that's why I think it's going to be more like August.
Now, please, if I can ask you about the Artemis III program, because Starship is supposed to take the astronauts to the moon. How realistic is it by end of 2026?
That's probably a stretch goal to be able to get it in 2026. Just looking at all the delays, I don't know if they figured out the spacesuits yet, because I know there was a problem with that. So you're talking about Artemis III, which would be the actual landing, versus Artemis II, which would just be circumnav. So it might be a rather aggressive goal based on a lot of other things. And remember, there's a lot of key components in there. We need a lander. So a lander hasn't been tested yet. And they've got two designs. One of them is coming from SpaceX, which is basically a different version of the Starship without heat tiles, without the flaps on it and everything else. But it needs propellant to get from low Earth orbit to the moon. So you have to do propellant refueling to be able to pull that trick off. So how do you do that? Well, that means you need to bring up a lot of boosters with the additional fuel to be able to do it. And that's why it's key for them to be able to grab this, because they're going to need several launches to be able to have enough to be able to bring the manned landing system there. So you have to follow it. It's going to be dictated by how successful this is. And that's why I think a lot of people are upbeat that they were able to stick this, that maybe they will be able to actually progress a lot sooner. They already demonstrated being able to do a propellant transfer from one tank to another internally. They haven't been able to do it from two different ships. That's going to be the next goals, but that's probably at least a year away. So 2025, they might start to be demonstrating that at the earliest in orbit. So I think landing in 2026 is that's going to be tough. That's going to be tough, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that it's often these space dates are getting,
Yeah.
it's like a
Yeah.
normal thing, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Well,
And
but there's another problem there is that Artemis itself, there's a problem with the heat shielding. So the Orion capsule that came back had is supposed to be an ablative heat shield, but more than just ablating, they had chunks that fell off. And they're using the same material as an Apollo, but they didn't manufacture it the same way. They thought they could get away with much larger hexagonal sheets, and the Apollo engineers realized that you needed to have them very, very small because there's a possibility of this thing's fracturing and falling off. And that's okay if you have really, really small cells. They decided to manufacture them bigger, and one of those fractures and comes off. It's a big chunk. So they're having to redesign the heat shield alone just for Artemis 2. So I think there's a lot of these delays that are going to be built in. It probably will be closer to 2030, I think, before you get it, because there's just so many things that have to work. It's a very, very complex configuration compared to Apollo.
thank you. And a little bit on that note, we are seeing SpaceX having great success here in the United States, all over the world. How relevant is it in comparison to NASA? Do you think NASA is losing a little bit of its prestige because it started outsourcing a lot? Now we have Boeing coming in. Should we like more companies expect to come in and NASA be sort of in the background of it? Or what do you think is the development going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main problem that you see at NASA is you've got this huge bureaucracy, and they're kind of they're risk averse. They're doing everything to make sure that things aren't going to go wrong. And as a result, your timetables slip and slip and slip and slip. The other thing, of course, is NASA has to satisfy all these different groups. So that means you can't concentrate it in one particular area. You have to make sure each congressional delegation gets a little bit of piece of the pie. That's kind of slows things down. So it's kind of politics. And that's why you can see a company like SpaceX being very aggressive. And hopefully that injects like a different sense of purpose into a lot of these things, that rather than these really long kind of mission plans and stuff like that, that they start saying, no, let's start accomplishing things a lot quicker. So I hope they can get back to kind of the old NASA of a sense of urgency and just go ahead and solve the problems.
That makes sense. I think Elon Musk even mentioned it that NASA is the sort of the safety blocker and SpaceX is the one who is very innovative, going,
Yes.
straight to everything. And now, on ISS, NASA said that it wants to sort of destroy the ISS by 2031. And I wanted to ask, do you think it will harm the international cooperation in space? Russia is trying to build its own orbital space station. China already has
Yes,
this,
yep.
even though we don't talk about it actually much, but it has it for about 2 years by now. What do you think will be the international cooperation in space after that?
Uh, Hopefully we get back to cooperation, but unfortunately, what you're probably going to see is there's going to be different islands of of countries developing these things. They've all learned a lot about how to build a space station and maybe how to not build one. And unfortunately, I mean, it's getting pretty old, and it's being held together almost with like band-aids and chewing gum. So at this point, it probably has to be decommissioned. Unfortunately, I know there are some groups that are trying to figure out how to salvage part of it or maybe reuse a bit of it, but it's unfortunately it's going to have to come down. That's kind of the reality. The only other option is to somehow be able to boost it very high and like put it into a very safe orbit that's not going to bother anything else, almost kind of like a graveyard orbit, with the idea of preserving it. Because think about it, it's like we're not going to be able to bring it down to the Smithsonian Museum. It would be great to be able to do that, but it would be nice to be able to preserve it when we have the technology to maybe do that someday, or it actually is a museum in space itself that later generations will be able to go ahead and visit. That's one possibility, but it probably is not going to happen. It's probably going to. Now, it's possible because if you look at it, it may be that the delta V you need to deorbit the thing completely might almost be the same as boosting it somewhere else. So you have to go up there and do that. Possibly it makes sense. But they may be afraid that there's other complications of just leaving something sitting out there unattended.
And talking about that, do you think, United States has sort of leading edge in space?
Mhm.
Would you say that Russia or China can catch up, or maybe India, other countries who
Oh
are
yeah,
trying
yeah.
to?
I mean, I think China is making incredible strides. They're launching a lot. They have a lot of different vehicles. They're getting a lot of experience, crewed experience in space. They're building their own space station. So yeah, I mean, they're nipping at the heels of the U.S. space program right now. I mean, in many ways, they were kind of ahead for a while because the U.S. was not able to put any crew into space without relying on other countries. And of course, Russia has definitely a lot of experience, and the Soyuz capsule and everything like that it's a workhorse. I mean, you just think about it. It has put a lot of payload, a lot of astronauts and cosmonauts into orbit, and there was like only one abort that I'm aware of. That was a few years ago, and of course, it was a successful abort, which is also tells you a lot about the resiliency of the system. So yeah, they all do. It's a matter of priorities because with all the countries, it takes a certain amount of money and a certain amount of effort. And I think what SpaceX is doing is shaking things up, showing that there's a different path that I think they're all going to follow. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, last question on space, then I would move to the ground. On satellites, we know their number is increasing and increasing, but there are also rhetoric such as United States blaming Russia for wanting or carrying up their satellite, carrying counter space weapons, nuclear counter space weapons. Russia said it's misinformation. On the other hand, Russia blamed the United States that it's using commercial satellites for intelligence, for military strikes. Do you think this sphere of using satellites for bad purposes here on the ground is going to increase?
I hope not, because it creates a certain amount of tension that shouldn't be there. It would be nice if, the satellites that are really meant for commercial purposes really stick with that. There's always going to be a lot of bleed over because obviously if you're taking images can be used for any purpose, especially if they're in the public domain. But it's a concern because if anything starts happening in low Earth orbit, then it's not going to be usable for anyone. So I don't think any nation really wants anything to go up there. So the best thing is for there to be some sort of agreements or treaties on that. And hopefully, if there's some way of being able to counter some sort of military assets up there, it's more of just jamming or preventing it from being able to work as opposed to
Yeah.
to using kinetic kind of devices, which will then just have pretty much a snowball effect that all the satellites in that area would then be inoperable. So hopefully we can get some sort of cooperation. And I would like to see it go even further than that, that at some point, drone swarms and stuff like that, we, that's just not where we want to go. Okay. So we need to start thinking about de-escalating everything and how we can start using space for really peaceful purposes as much as we can.
You probably followed the UN Security Council was trying to adopt a resolution on non-placement of weapons
Yeah.
in space. Unfortunately, it failed. United
Yeah.
States wanted to focus on nuclear weapons. Russia wanted to use all weapons. So they didn't find an agreement. But we can only hope that in the future they will
Yes.
find
Yes.
some.
Yes. Because once something happens up there, then it's going to be unusable for like hundreds of years, or very difficult to be able to go back into space because you will just have a junkyard up there and it will just be too hazardous. So I think all nations are aware of that and realize that you want to de-escalate.
Now, okay, it's still 5 minutes. If I can move quickly to ground,
Sure.
Tesla said that end of April, Tesla said that its robots, Optimus, they want to use them in their factories by 2026, end of 2026.
Yep.
I wonder how realistic this goal is and when we could think of
Yeah.
having these humanoids at home with kids.
Right. Okay. So I think they're looking at it in the factory by not the end of 2026, but the end of this year. And they already have a couple. They showed that about 6 to 8 weeks ago. I think they did show Optimus doing some simple operations, and they announced in a post just yesterday or the day before They have two that are actually operating in one of the factories. I think it's on the battery line. So it's a proof of concept that they're able to do it, and they're just going to scale from there. Because if you look in the factory through there, there's a lot of what I call low-hanging fruit, very, very simple operations that Optimus could do. And by the end of the year, you'll be seeing a lot of that. So it'll be doing what Elon said is useful work. And in order for it to be useful work, it means it actually has to be productive. It actually has to be accomplishing the task, the same cycle time as a human operator, same reliability, and the same duration. So it has to be able to last a whole shift without someone else having to take over. And finally, it has to be able to prove that it can do it at the same cost. Because if it costs 2 or 3 times as much as manual labor, it makes absolutely no sense. You're going to start seeing that, and I'm confident that they're going to do it because there are other robot companies that are already doing the same thing, that are starting to do that. So for instance, Agility Robotics is already doing it in the logistics space. And they already proved it last December. They were able to fill in a labor shortage for, I think it was Spanex, that they were actually being able to pack a lot of the packages with a humanoid type of robot. So we know it can be done, and we can know it can be actually done for a reasonable cost. So it'd be the same as human labor. So we'll see that. Possibly next year, they may be selling them to other customers, and it could be by the end of the decade for sure, you'll probably start seeing it in the homes. There's a lot that are going in homes already, but more for research and development and testing purposes. But as far as like you and me being able to purchase it, I think before 2030, you'll be able to do it.
Thank you. Last quick question. Again, comparing it on international scale, in comparison to other countries, China just put out a statement saying they want to mass produce their advanced humanoids by 2025. How do you think United States is standing in comparison to other humanoids from other countries?
Okay, so China has proven that they can move really quickly when they decide to focus on something. So a lot of companies, if you come out of nowhere and have proven that the walking problem must be easier than we thought because so many of them solved it in like a matter of months almost. So there's enough technology out there to do it, and enough understanding of that. But that's only part of the problem, because this is the interesting part of the robot, not walking. And so a lot of the Chinese bots haven't quite got like the hands down yet. And there are, I would say, like a lot of North American companies, because I want to like bring Canada into it as well, that are already successfully deploying these and working on that and have been in that space. There hasn't been a national initiative like in China, and it would be nice for there maybe to be a bit more. But a lot of universities are taking up the call. A lot of small companies, startups are doing it. You know, we're aware of Boston Dynamics has been working on it for a while. There's also Apptronic. There's also Sanctuary, along with Tesla Bot.
It's more private companies.
These are private
focused,
companies
right?
that are doing
Whereas
it.
China is more state scale.
Yeah, and there's also Figure, and all of them have been very successful in being able to raise the capital they need to be able to do it. So I'd say right now it's the United States is better positioned than it was during the industrial robots, where very quickly they lost the lead. So the first industrial robot was Unimation. It's a U.S. brand. It seemed like they should do it, and then we dropped the ball, and then basically Japanese and European bots took over. And those companies ended up buying what was left of the American companies. So, but I think in this case, it's a little bit better, especially if people understand that there is a good business case. And usually that's how capitalism is supposed to work. Everyone realizes, wait a minute, there is a huge market potential there, and you see the money going there. And venture capital is throwing money at this problem.
Thank you so much, Scott. It was very enlightening. I really appreciate it.
Thank
I
you,
know you
Linda.
have to go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.